Now, governments should prioritize the protection of women, human rights defenders. That's according to Tiseke Kasambala from the Advancing Rights in Southern Africa program. This as the numbers of COVID-19 infections continues to rise on the African continent, rather. In an article, Kasambala says women human rights defenders have played an important role in fighting against the rollback of rights, and they remain vital vehicles for social change. She joins us now for more on that. Thank you very much for joining us, Tiseke. And now you looked at the Southern African region. Perhaps let's start with Zimbabwe and what it is that you found there.
Good afternoon, Dudu. Our findings show that across many countries in Southern Africa, including in Zimbabwe, women, in particular those work in the rural areas, so rural women, informal traders, rural women farmers, have been particularly affected by government restrictions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in Zimbabwe, for instance, many women were unable to trade informally because when the government instituted its lockdown, it prevented all forms of trade apart from essential trade. And informal traders were not a part of those who are designated as essential services or essential workers. And what happened is women lost their livelihoods. Police were violently disrupted their activities, including burning some of their produce. And a lot of them, obviously, due to restricted movements, could not go out and sell their wares or their produce. And this really disproportionately affected them. They were unable to feed their families. And so some of these responses have really had a huge social and economic impact on women, but also in terms of the violence that we've seen from a civil and political rights point of view, they've also had an impact.
Let's go to Lesotho and Eswatini. We find that women rights groups there are struggling to provide legal services to women involved in land grab and land dispute cases. What's going on?
Well, in Eswatini and Lesotho, as in a few other countries, women are particularly affected when it comes to their access to land and their land rights. And so historically, we've seen women often losing their right to land when they have been widowed and when families have come in and displaced them from the land. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions, where some families have taken advantage of these restrictions to seek to remove women from their land. And unfortunately, because of the lockdowns, women's law organizations who often provide legal services to these women have been unable to reach them because they're in the rural areas. And women themselves have been unable to access legal services to seek redress when they have been threatened with removal from their land.
What would you say exacerbates the situation when we look at a country like Malawi, for instance? Representation of women at the highest echelons of leadership is lacking.
It definitely is. And if you have been following developments in Malawi recently with the new cabinet, we just saw that a significant number of women were excluded from senior cabinet positions under this new government. And we've seen a similar thing in terms of how governments have consulted citizens and sought to allow access to consultations and participation amongst women. And in places like Malawi, women's human rights organizations have complained that they have been excluded from consultations and participation on the government task force, which is responsible for overseeing the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Only 4 out of 21 women only 4 out of 21 people on that committee were actually women, and that's very problematic. So women are being excluded from the decision-making processes and participating in these decision-making processes related to the responses to the pandemic.
Tiseke, the importance of language. In a country like Botswana, you find that the lack of information on the pandemic in indigenous languages is persistent, thus making this all the more difficult.
Indeed, and again, it's as I keep saying, it's all about exclusion. What we found is that indigenous people have been excluded from conversations around government health responses to the pandemic. The information in terms of how to prevent getting infected with COVID-19, information about mitigating it if you have COVID-19 is not available in indigenous languages. And what exacerbates this for indigenous women is the fact that they have lower literacy rates than indigenous men. And so they are put at an even worse advantage when it comes to having access to that information, and yet they are the caregivers in those families and in those communities.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. The Advancing Rights in Southern Africa Program's Chief of Party, Tiseke Kasambala.